Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. So I hope you guys really enjoy this episode. I'm talking to Brad Dieter. It is literally just fantastic. He's the COO of Macros Inc., the Director of Science of Highness Biotechnics, and a nutrition coach as well. This guy is ridiculously smart. It's pretty insane. We touch on one of the topics that I'm obviously extremely passionate about is diabetes. We talk about a variety of things around it, but I'm really fucking excited to release this episode, really. It's been one that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I think Brad was the perfect person to talk about these topics with, because diabetes to me is just like heartbreaking and frightening, but also one of the most complex problems that we have to solve in society. And I think this podcast helped me sort of think about more how we can solve it, if it's solvable, etc., etc. So yeah, if you're looking to find Brad online, you can find Brad at Brad Dieter PhD on Instagram. So Brad_Dieter PhD. That's spelled dieter, but it's pronounced Dieter. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and thank you very much for listening. Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. So this week I'm extremely excited to be chatting to Brad Dieter. So Brad, he has done a lot of research in his time, and that's something that I find extremely fascinating. But Brad has also done a lot of things in terms of the entrepreneurial world, which I also find pretty interesting, because those two things I think sometimes go hand in hand, but sometimes also they directly oppose each other in terms of the goal or the way that you go about doing them. But Brad specifically has done a lot of research around diabetes, which, if you know me, is something I find quite fascinating. So Brad, would you be able to sort of outline how you sort of got to where you are today in terms of, one, research for diabetes, but then how did all of this entrepreneurial stuff come into it as well? Because I think that's quite fascinating. How did you get to where you are?
Yeah, the short version is just serendipity and I guess random chance. The long version is, so I started my kind of undergraduate college education in kind of biomedical pre-med work, and then wasn't quite sure if I wanted to go to medical school. So I did my pre-med prereqs and then finished my undergrad in business administration and finance, and then worked in kind of the pharmaceutical world for about a year and a half or so, and then decided I didn't want to go to medical school, but I wanted to stay in the medical field. So I went back and I did a master's in biomechanics, because I was working at that time, I was working in the orthopedic industry. So I was really interested in kind of the biomechanics of prostheses and things like that. And then finished my master's and decided I didn't really have enough kind of physiology, molecular biology background, because that was kind of where my interest was starting to shift. So I did my PhD work was in exercise physiology, but I primarily did kind of molecular biology work. And that was where I started getting into the diabetes research. So my PhD work was focused on diabetic cardiomyopathy. We did some really cool research studies with grizzly bears and exercising mice, and did a couple human projects in there as well. So we got to do some really cool stuff kind of around the diabetes and kind of end organ complications. And then did my fellowship in diabetes and kidney disease, where I focused more on metabolism and inflammation in diabetes in the kidney. And then stayed on after my fellowship for almost 2 years as kind of a faculty scientist. And then somewhere in the transition between finishing my PhD work and my fellowship, I started doing more industry work and kind of fell into the entrepreneurship route. And then that's kind of just taken over most of my time. And from there, I've built a couple kind of health technology companies and health coaching companies, and then biotech companies, and then a couple other things along the way. So that's kind of how I got to where I am today.
I think it's a fascinating journey. It seems, because it's not like you're someone who's sort of all over social media and sort of, posting every day about this. Like, I don't know, like you're not sort of posting about it and trying to like do that. But then it's like, I think this is why I want to talk to you, because I think there's a lot that you probably don't get to hear, because I don't think you
you don't seem to be sort of putting yourself out there that much online. And I don't know if that's purposeful or not, but I think it's.
I don't know how people have enough time, to be honest. Like, I'll pick up my phone and I'll be like, oh, I haven't posted anything on Instagram in 6 days. And it's like, that doesn't surprise me. I haven't even looked at Instagram in 6 days. So it's, I always find interesting people who have like 3 or 4 or 5 things going up a day. I'm like, you're actually getting work done. So maybe people are a lot better at managing their social media time and more thoughtful, but I'm there and I'm present, but I'm not super, I don't have a huge presence there just because I've got too many other things that I want to spend my time doing. Yeah,
well, I think it's probably the most likely thing to make people less productive is probably social media at this point. It's like, it's literally like the biggest drain on productivity, but what can you do? Not use it maybe. One of the things that I thought is sort of interesting and sort of a question that I'm currently actually trying to answer for myself is, in terms of the research, was there a reason, because doing the exercise physiology, was it sort of obvious for you to go down sort of the more disease state sort of research, and instead of sort of going down research in terms of exercise science or stuff like that? Because I know you've done a few papers in exercise science, which particularly I really enjoyed the one with Helms and Gary Slater, where you're talking about the amount of a surplus and things like that. Do you find, in general, between those two kinds of research, does there feel as though there's a different meaning between the two? So, for instance, hypertrophy research for hypertrophy's sake is all good and fun, but it's not going to save the world. It's definitely like making a bodybuilder's bicep bigger doesn't contribute, I would say, too much to the world. In some ways, in other ways, it definitely does. But then if you do diabetes research, you're stopping people getting their foot amputated, or you're stopping people getting a diabetic ulcer that does not go away, or a plethora of other conditions. Does that sort of, do those two kinds of research feel different?
Yes and no. I think I'll kind of give you my rationale of why I have done the research I've done. One is I've kind of always viewed my life as accumulating skill sets, right? Instead of just like picking one thing and doing that my whole life, each kind of phase of your life really is about accumulating skills, right? Kind of think about it like when you're a very small child, right? You're just like, you're learning to walk, you're learning to talk, you're learning to interact with people and learning social norms. And then the rest of your life is kind of the same thing, right? Like the more skills you can accumulate, the more you can transfer those to other areas of your life. So I was really interested in kind of exercise as medicine as the approach. And then when I went into my graduate work, I was like, okay, how can I take that interest and pair it to a very rigorous training model, right? So kind of the biomedical PhD world type of work has a very rigorous, very kind of structured way of learning. And so I kind of wanted to merge those two together. So that's kind of why I did that. And then it's also, easier to get funding for that type of research. So if you kind of want to build an academic career for a while, you have to be able to get funding. So it's much easier to get funding for trying to develop treatments for diseases than, trying to figure out what's the best way to make a bicep grow. Right. So it's kind of the pragmatic piece of like, hey, here's how I become a really, really good scientist. Here's how I get some funding to have a decade-long career. And then how can I take those skills and transfer those into areas, that I am interested in terms of application and applied science.
Yeah, because it's definitely kind of, I find it's a question I find myself referring back to often. It's definitely, it's constantly conflicting, I would say. But it's I like how you've outlined it there. It's like, it's obviously, it's not like I think they definitely both have utility, and it's like how you've outlined kind of, there's a lot of doing research in one area may have carryover to the other, and then vice versa, and then carry over to all areas of life, which is, I think, quite cool. But one of the things, obviously, you've done a lot of research on diabetes. Would you better sort of outline your general consensus to what you think are the general mechanisms that cause diabetes, whether that be the literal like chemical mechanisms, I don't even know if that's the right word, or just literally what has changed in just society to cause and like this uptick in diabetes? What do you think is the general factors there?
Yeah, so the first answer is just kind of differentiating between type 1 diabetes and type 2. Obviously, this discussion will focus primarily on type 2 because type 1 is a completely different type of disease. So really what we've really learned about type 2 diabetes over the last probably, wow, it's 2020 now, so about 25, 30 years or so of kind of very rigorous work in the field is it's really a disease of disordered metabolism that primarily arises from energy overload, right? And that energy overload can come from, either having too much body fat, too much excess energy in the body, or it can come from having just too low of energy flux out of the body, right? So that's kind of the way we can think about it is energy overload or too little energy flux out of the body. That's kind of the highest level picture. Now, underneath that, there's things that kind of precipitate the main feature of the disease, which is kind of insulin resistance, right? We know that is like if you do biochemical analyses on tissue, energy overload there, like just too much stuff in the cells, whether it's primarily fatty acids, too much fatty acid in cells causes insulin resistance. Dovetailing off that are things like inflammation and oxidative stress all contribute to insulin resistance. And so those are kind of the primary main mechanisms that drive type 2 diabetes, right? And that's pretty well established at this point. There's really not much controversial about that kind of way of thinking about it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find commonly, I actually had a researcher on here a long time ago, maybe a year ago. I don't even mention this, but I don't want to go into sort of the whole keto thing, but commonly people will, and this is one of the hypotheses that I've sort of wondered about a little bit in terms of the high carb thing of causing diabetes, and I'm very skeptical of this approach. So one of the things they would sort of say is along the lines of basically they're saying that their argument was that a high carbohydrate diet now would basically set you up for diabetes in the future. Do you think there's any credence to that, or any way that could be true, or is true, or is just a potential factor? Or
yes, so it can be true, but primarily for reasons that people don't really consider, right? So you can consume a high carbohydrate diet in the context of energy balance or energy deficits, right? Like you can consume a 85% carbohydrate diet and maintain a very lean body mass, or you can consume a very high carbohydrate diet in the context of an energy surplus, right? And so those are two very different situations.
Yeah.
So in the situation where you have energy balance or you have an energy deficit over a long period of time, the likelihood of you developing type 2 diabetes on a high carbohydrate diet is virtually non-existent, right? It's in the 1% to 2% range, right? It's very, very, very low. If you consume a high carbohydrate diet in the context of an energy surplus, over a long enough period of time, your likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes increases tenfold from baseline, right? On the flip side, the same thing can be said about a higher fat diet. The likelihood and the risks of developing type 2 diabetes in those different contexts are, for all intents and purposes, identical, right? So your risk is really less determined by macronutrients than it is by energy balance over a lifetime and energy flux over a lifetime.
Yeah, because I think people have, generally you get the picture from the outside that, like, very quickly, even in my university degree, we were kind of taught, and I was quite sort of astounded by it. We were kind of taught that carbohydrates were quite an issue. And I was kind of like, this is like, I don't know if that's the case, really. It's like, and then we were kind of also, it felt as though a lot of the time we were kind of meant to, maybe for political reasons, sort of not meant to associate obesity and diabetes whatsoever. And like, yes, there's obviously not everyone with obesity has diabetes. That's definitely the case. But a lot of people with diabetes will have obesity. Would you say that's generally pretty correct?
Yes. Yeah. And part of this issue with kind of lack of clarity around the role of carbohydrates in diabetes, one comes from just the long history of, people with type 1 diabetes and how they metabolize carbohydrates
Right.
can be very problematic, right? Because there's just a lot of other things that go on in that situation, that carbohydrates and diabetes are very intermingled in the context of type 1 diabetes. And then we get into this, the different disease of type 2 diabetes. And the main symptom of type 2 diabetes is dysregulated blood sugar or dysregulated blood glucose, right?
Yeah.
So then you start thinking, okay, the body's not properly managing blood glucose. Carbohydrates are one of the main sources of glucose that our body gets throughout the day. So there's probably an interrelationship there, right? And so that's kind of where those get conflicted. But the problem is when you look at a disease and you take its symptoms and you try to make that as the main cause of it, then you really start to kind of muddy the waters and you don't really have a good understanding of kind of what's happening at the fundamental level that's causing the disease, what's exacerbating the disease, et cetera. And the other piece to that too is a lot of times people have this assumption of causes and symptoms, or causes and things that make a disease worse are the same thing, right? And sometimes the causal factor is not the same thing that makes it worse, and the symptom is not the same thing that causes the disease.
So would you say that's definitely the case for diabetes, where it's sort of do you think a person, I don't want to go into the territory of keto here, but a person with diabetes should sort of generally, it's more likely that a high carbohydrate or high glycemic load, once they're already diabetic, could become more of an issue rather than down the track if their energy balance is in check or down.
And that's exactly a piece of it too, right? Is if you have somebody who does have type 2 diabetes, one, you kind of have to figure out how far along the disease are they, right? So somebody who's recently diagnosed, it's probably early in the disease. How you kind of prescribe or program a nutrition intervention for that person looks much different than somebody who's, had complete beta cell failure, makes no insulin, they're on insulin therapy, they're 250 pounds overweight. That's a much different scenario. So,
do you think commonly, and I find it quite a difficult one, but do you think generally, like once someone's already pre-diabetic or they're on the road there or getting there, what is kind of, in your view, what are some of the best interventions from there to reduce the risk of them becoming full-on type 2 diabetic? Because, for instance, someone that I've spoken to in the past who has held a relatively high academic status, they sort of said something along the lines of, and it was sort of a clinical there in practice. They said something along the lines of basically saying they've never ever seen someone go from pre-diabetic back to normal. They've only ever seen them go from pre-diabetic to full-on diabetic. And I find it, strange. I find it very strange.
Yeah, well, that person hasn't read any of the major literature on the topic. So that's actually been one of the biggest areas of investigation starting in the kind of mid 90s through now. Is there's been, like in the US, there was the diabetes prevention program, right? So where they looked at lifestyle intervention, diet, moderate exercise, and they looked at standard of care pharmaceuticals, so metformin, amongst people who had prediabetes. And they looked at, how many people, with no intervention proceeded from prediabetes to diabetes in each of those arms, and then how many people kind of reverted to a normal phenotype. And we do know that, lifestyle interventions, diet and exercise, are more effective at kind of preventing that transition from prediabetes to diabetes than medications are, if you can sustain the intervention.
Yeah.
We do know that medications can help prevent the transition from prediabetes to diabetes. And we do know that when weight loss occurs in that lifestyle intervention, you actually can see a phenotype go from pre-diabetic back to kind of a normal phenotype, right? Where their elevated blood sugar drops, kind of their insulin levels start to decrease, and they start to resemble more normal phenotypes.
I find generally it's because it feels frustrating for me when, like, I think obesity is a complex one. Like, I was speaking to Alan Flanagan a while ago, and we were sort of talking about sort of the more political side of obesity, and it's definitely important, right? But then I definitely find I find it frustrating when people try to get away from losing weight, and it's or not get that sort of, that could be misinterpreted, that phrase, but even researchers or practitioners will sort of say, oh, well, we can't always just lose weight. And I find it frustrating because it's obviously losing weight is incredibly difficult, but I think it's like usually it's the most or one of the most important things we could do, but it's definitely ridiculously hard. In terms of like the general sort of outline of this whole thing, would you say in general, if we sort of term it the obesogenic environment, would you say those are the sort of general societal factors that have led to this rise? Like in general, the same sort of things, for instance, more palatable food, less satiating food. So in general, people are eating more calories. Macronutrient ratios don't really play into that much, I would say. And then also, people are generally moving less. People generally have less healthy lives in terms of, for instance, they might, like generally people will just be, their calorie intake's going up in general due to a bunch of societal factors, or their calorie expenditures definitely going down. Would you say that is generally the case? And do you think that is the main kind of, everything that leads to that has kind of caused a lot of this, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that it's, we can look at, I think it's very clear that environmental pieces are what's driving the kind of obesity phenotype we're seeing just kind of take over humanity. I say that one, you can kind of look at, it's not a massive genetic change, right? Genetic changes don't occur over the span of 30 years, right? It takes multiple generations for genetic changes to really manifest. Even things like genetic changes don't really appear to explain the obesity, swift change. We see that the same patterns of kind of socioeconomic changes that occur result in the same phenotype, right? So when you can look across the globe and look at, the U.S. transition in our phenotype, Mexico's transition in their phenotype from kind of developing to developed. We can look at China, we can look at India, and we can start to look at pockets of Africa that are developing. And the same socioeconomic things that occur precipitate the same phenotype change, right?
Yeah. Would you read what do you mean when you say phenotype change? What do you specifically mean by that?
Yeah, so we see just people getting, heavier, right? Their BMIs and their body fats are decreasing, right? And then with that comes, blood pressure changes, metabolic changes, all those things. So all those kind of phenotypic traits. It's not just the obesity piece; it's all the other kind of disease factors that come with it.
Do you, in terms of the researchers, do you feel as though most people are aiming at the same sort of targets in terms of treating it? Do you feel as though in general that's the case? Because at my university, I feel as though it's frustrating because it feels as though the consensus is, it's much more along the lines of keto. And it's like, I find it like, I feel like we're wasting our time here. For me, it's like the most obvious intervention for me seems to be hypertrophy. And it's like, that's just that's one mechanism, but it's like, and it's extremely hard to implement, but it's like, so is keto. And like, I don't think that even seems to have much of an impact. And I've seen some things that seem to say that things like keto could make it worse. And then you compare it to exercise interventions and it seems like, why are we I don't know. It seems highly illogical or
Yeah, so I think, everybody has their own kind of perspective and bent on things depending on how much they've invested in their lives in one area, right?
Mm.
So, I mean, we have huge groups of people that are lifestyle intervention, right? Diet and exercise. And then even in that, there's people, it's like, well, we just need to get people to walk around more. And then there's people like, we need to get everybody resistance training. And then there's pockets of everybody needs to do high intensity interval training for all these metabolic benefits. And then you have the pharmaceutical side, right? Like, what drugs can we develop, right? Can we have drugs that cause people to pee out 400 or 500 calories a day in sugar? Do we have drugs that can cause people to just burn more calories from, mitochondrial uncoupling? Can we give people, anorexic drugs that make them stop eating? And then we have built environment people who are like, if I just build more bike paths, people walk around more. And so it's kind of, everybody has their own lens on the problem, right? And it really kind of depends on which population you're studying, right? So like, we can look at just different pockets, right? If we looked at where I live, the things that would probably help reduce the obesity rates here in Eastern Washington are substantially different than what would help people in Mississippi, right? And that's substantially different than what would help people in Mexico City. And that's substantially different than what would help people in New Zealand, right? So while most of the causal factors are shared amongst populations, there's different pieces that make different populations that are kind of their lynch points, right? Or their pivot points of what's really driving that in that situation. So I think I don't think any one research group has the right answer. I think it's going to be a combination of trying to figure out what's the best implementation of all of these pieces in different situations.
Yeah, because I was thinking that me putting my weight behind hypertrophy so strongly is in itself kind of dogmatic. It's kind of, if I just think that is like this golden thing, this golden egg to solve diabetes, it's kind of like, well, it has a lot of holes in the application of that. And like, if you think about New Zealand and its problem with diabetes, most people in New Zealand are very active. Like, and even I find among a lot of diabetics, they're relatively active. So for instance, when I had patients in podiatry, a lot of them were relatively active or more active than you would think. And I mean, commonly, once they get to sort of quite overweight, and then sort of they got a lot of issues, like for instance, you probably have encountered or are aware of a lot of the issues that arise in people's feet due to diabetes. It's like very common.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with deciding what your torch is going to be and carrying that as high as you can, right? Like, if you can be the voice that gets a couple thousand people to really buy into like, hey, resistance training is really going to help my diabetes, then great, right? Same thing with people who are built environment people, right? If we can get a couple people to motivate several cities to make their cities more kind of walkable, green, change that. If we can get 3 or 4 people to really change food culture in a city, and that's kind of the torch they carry, great, right? Everybody kind of has to have the torch that they carry.
How sort of optimistic do you generally feel about the likelihood of solving it relatively soon, or do you think it's kind of, do you feel pessimistic about it at all?
Or? It depends on the day. Some days I'm super optimistic, and then some days I'm like, we're in a big world of hurt. I think it's one of those things that we're going to kind of hit saturation, right? Of like, the people who are going to become obese, we've kind of maxed out that population.
Okay.
And I think we're slowly getting there. Actually, I think if you kind of just look at historical data and you kind of think about how, these types of things kind of propagate through culture over time is, we're in the US, we're at 35% obesity rates. Wow. And it's starting to flatten out a little bit. So, 40% is probably going to be where we start to kind of really see a leveling off. We're almost there. Now, the problem is it's if we hit a prevalence rate of 40%, that's kind of where it caps, but the population keeps getting bigger. That burden keeps getting larger. So my worry is the problem will get so big we just can't address it from like a financial logistic cost perspective, and then it's going to have to be the newer generations kind of replacing the sick generation. So I think we have a lot of work to do on prevention, and I think that's where most of the long-term effects are going to be. I think trying to take the current 35% of developed countries population that's obese and trying to revert it back, I think is going to be incredibly difficult, and it's going to be having to change. Yeah. So I think we still have to do a lot to try to help the current population in terms of disease management, trying to improve remission rates, and then a lot of it's going to be prevention.
Like that's literally the reason why I don't want to be a podiatrist, because it's like your ability to prevent it is zero. Like it's not there. It's not possible. It's like, as a podiatrist, the prevention of diabetes, it's like the fact that one of the people who taught me a lot about podiatry was saying that they've never seen someone go back from pre-diabetic to normal. It's like, to me, that says something. It's like, well, as a podiatrist, you kind of don't have the scope for that, but it's kind of.
Yeah. And that's why we need a new generation of different healthcare professionals, right? I think in my mind, one of the big solutions is kind of taking the health and fitness professional and having them be the exercises, medicine, healthy lifestyle, prevention kind of piece of the healthcare system. And I think that's, I think we're kind of in that flux of like, hey, personal trainers used to be like, let's make you look as good as you can in the gym. And now we're slowly starting to arm them with the skill set, in the scope of practice, in the training, to kind of be more, kind of frontline medical people.
Yeah. It's something that I think is quite cool as well. It's sort of, people are generally becoming more educated as practitioners. It's like you have podcasts like these, or like Revive Stronger or something similar, where you're getting a very, very intelligent people on, you're asking them very intelligent questions, and you have places like PTC or like JPS mentorship, where it's like they're learning some pretty sort of high level things compared to what a lot of PTs learn sort of at their first qualification. It's like you're getting quite up there in terms of getting closer to medicine. And it's definitely, do you think like we're approaching that fast in terms of the fitness industry? Like, do you feel as though that's happening faster than it used to? Or do you feel as though,
I think it's a little bit of the Wild West right now. Like we have a lot of very, very smart people kind of leading the charge and bringing a lot of people with them. And we're starting to slowly figure out, like, how do we put structure around this?
Yes.
How do we build accredited certifications? And then, education is one thing, and then actual like hands-on training is another. So I think, we have pockets of people and organizations that are, seeing this need and this gap. And we're, kind of at pockets at a time, we're starting to do that. And I think kind of as we all continue to grow and mature, it's kind of building standards, raising, all that stuff across the board to train those people in those capacities. Very similar to how, the allopathic medicine model emerged, right? As there were these people who were trained by other doctors and would train a few more, and then they built medical schools, and then they built, governing boards. And I think we're kind of in that flux of trying to feel out, where is that space? How do we navigate insurance pieces? How do we navigate liability pieces? How do we navigate accreditation and all that stuff?
Yeah, because I find a lot of what seems to be, I think that there's a big difference between like a lot of like, there's a wide range of fitness professionals, and it's such a massive range that it's like you have people like Eric Helms who coach people, and then you have people like a PT who's just got out of PT school like 6 months ago. Like that's a ridiculous gap. Like it's just not even comparable, right? It's like, I don't know. That's the hope that I kind of have for, and I think I as time goes on, I try to not let myself be so hopeful for hypertrophy as a mechanism for health, but I definitely think it's like, for general, like So I'll segue into this. Do you think this is sometimes somewhat going away from diabetes, but definitely still involving in that? How much do you think the application of hypertrophy or resistance training or anything along those lines can sort of be a mechanism for health to combat sort of, for instance, things like sarcopenia, obviously, or things like just general lifestyle disease sort of issues? Because, for instance, if you compare it to something like just cardiovascular training, it seems to be, in my eyes, the impact of it seems to be a lot easier and somewhat easier to implement as well in some cases.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits, right? There's kind of the, quality of life as people age, right? The more muscle mass you carry into, elderly living, and the more strength you carry, the better your quality of life. The more mobile you are, the less likely you are to have a bunch of chronic diseases. From an acute perspective, we know that resistance training has some additional metabolic advantages over cardiovascular training for kind of muscle tissue metabolism, in terms of ameliorating some of those issues that occur in kind of the diabetes phenotype. We know that it can be a little more beneficial than cardiovascular training in some of those aspects. We know it's kind of, if you match it time for time, it's a little bit more beneficial too. So there's a lot of good benefits to it. And I think it's one intervention that can be really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's because for me, it seems like this. Obviously I love hypertrophy, so it's like, I think I'm extremely biased towards it, but it's like,
at least you're biased, right? As long as you're like, this is who I am. It was like, I was at a conference. Have you ever been to like an academic conference before?
Barely.
Okay. So they, like, people always give their talk, and then people always get up and ask them like kind of really kind of like rude questions just to try to like poke them a little bit. And it was this young guy, I think he was in his PhD program. And this very senior guy stands up and he's like, "You spent the whole time talking about mTOR, for this disease. And mTOR really isn't that big of a factor in this disease. So why did you focus on mTOR?" And he was just like, "Dude, I'm the mTOR guy. That's all I care about. We studied this disease in our lab, so I just looked at mTOR and that's all I cared about." And I was like, that's the best answer, right? Just be like, "Hey, this is my bias. This is all I really care about. It's all I wanted to study. So that's what we're going to talk about." So yeah, that's just part of it.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of obvious. Like, it's like, I have a podcast where I just talk about primarily hypertrophy, and then we'll end stuff like this. And it's like, I have a company where I just think about hypertrophy for the last 4 years. All I've wanted to do is hypertrophy. And during my undergrad, it was a joke when I asked the question. It was like, for instance, one time we had a slideshow on some disease, and they mentioned steroids. Oh no, it was tendinopathy, I believe, or it was tendon issues in general, I think. And they had a slide basically listing steroids as a risk factor, and I was like, I put my hand up and I was like, what, like, which steroids? You can't just, I was kind of like, you can't just say steroids, like that's a, they were talking about anabolic steroids, and I was like, I don't think I asked the lecturer, I was like, what do you mean, and what steroids, in what case, and what mechanism? Like, I was kind of like, but it was just like, this is a podiatry class, mate. This is not an anabolic steroids 101. Like, it's just a joke. And like, every time, anytime hypertrophy was mentioned on the fucking slide, I was like sitting there, like refraining from asking questions. I'm just like, because it would just be like, "Oh, what are the best mechanisms for hypertrophy?" And they'd be like, "Sorry, what?" Like, it's not the fucking place for it. But yeah. One of the things that I find interesting about yourself is how you've sort of also done a lot of entrepreneurial stuff. In terms of like comparing research to that, do you find a lot of the time, is it a similar kind of mission statement, like similar kind of, okay, I want to advance health in this world. These are both pretty good ways to go about it. Do you feel as though they have different end outcomes, or do you feel as though it kind of ends up at the same place? Or what was the general reasoning for adding more of the entrepreneurial stuff in there? Or why is this? So this is sort of like looking on your Instagram, you can see it's quite a big passion of yours.
Yeah. I think they're very similar recipes, but very different flavors, if that makes any sense. So like, I think about, what are the big things that it takes to be successful in research, right? You have to be very analytical in problem solving. You have to be very patient and kind of delayed gratification, right? Like a lot of times, like you see a paper published and what you don't see is that paper took 5 years to get done, right? You know, you have to have a pretty kind of iron stomach for just like dealing with a lot of crap all the time. And you have to be willing to just ask people for money, right? And in research, you write, you know, you spend 9 to 12 months writing a grant where you're basically pitching people your idea and saying, hey, give me $2 million over the next 3 years so I can do this project. And 9 times out of 10, they say no, right? And so those are very good analogies for business, right? Is you're always solving a problem, right? Every day something comes up, you know, you have to solve something. You have to be very delayed gratification oriented, right? You'll spend 6, 9, 12 months working on something and you don't see the fruits of that labor for 5 years. You kind of have to have an iron stomach for stuff going wrong and really just dealing with a lot of crap. And then the last one is you have to, you know, be willing to ask people for money, right? You build something of value and you have to be able to say, hey, what I've built is worth X. I would like you to give me X in return for what I'm going to give you. So it's very similar in terms of like the recipe that it takes to do them both, but the outcomes are obviously very different, right? One is usually just for a scientific purpose, answering a question. And in business, it's solving a problem for a client. So very similar recipes, very kind of different flavors in the outcome.
Yeah. Do you find, was there, in both fields, was there ever a time where you sort of felt as though it was kind of, and I guess people generally tend to feel this a lot in sort of entrepreneurship or in probably in research as well, where it kind of feels like David and Goliath, like you versus the world. But I guess everyone tells themselves a story about their life. But did you ever sort of, was there ever a time where you're sort of thinking like, shit, I'm really trying to shove my foot through the door of whatever this is, and it feels as though the door keeps closing, but you know, you just keep shoving your foot through the door and then.
Yeah, that's pretty much every day, right? Things never go right the first time or the second time or the third time. And a lot of it just comes down to being overly stubborn, just being like, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to do. I'm just going to keep kicking on the door until either the hinges break or the door breaks or the person on the other side gets so sick of the noise they just let me in.
Yeah. Do you ever feel as though that kind of, because for instance, like myself, I don't think I'll ever want to or aim for a 9-to-5 job, and like respect to people who do. Like I don't know why. I think I'm too maybe privileged is the word in my case. Like I've got too much like I just love this one thing and I just want to do this one thing and I'm not willing to move on that fact. Do you ever feel as though there's sort of, have you ever struggled with sort of workaholic tendencies or like that sort of thing along the lines, or do you feel as though that's necessary in some cases or for a period of time at least?
Pretty much every day. Yeah. Like I would say from the age of probably 21 to probably now or 31, it was every second of every day was either working or thinking about work.
Right.
It was just when you have stuff that you're super interested in, and you kind of have this desire to get things done and succeed, is your brain kind of never shuts off. You kind of have to learn to manage that in the context of the rest of your life. And it can be really difficult, right? You're at a family dinner and you're like thinking about an email you should have responded to, but you didn't get to, but then you like can't enjoy the conversation you're having because you're like, crap, I need to respond to that email. So there's a lot of those things that you just kind of, some people are wired like that. That's kind of how I'm wired. Other people are wired very differently, right? Like my wife is a nurse and she goes to work, and when she comes home, it's like, that's it. There's nothing comes home with her. So she's able to compartmentalize pretty well. And me, it's a struggle.
Yeah, I feel a similar way. And I mean, I'm only 21, so it's like my responsibility at this age is pretty low. Like the burden that I have to bear is still pretty low, I would say. Like, and at times I've been worse in terms of being a workaholic, and I'm trying to figure out what the balance is, because I want to succeed more than anything really, but it's also like, oh, do I want to have friends and shit? And then do I want to like go out and like, most kids my age, especially in New Zealand, love partying. Like they want to drink every weekend and blah, 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 and waste their time watching Netflix. And do you ever regret like not doing more shit like that? Or do you find you were still able to fit shit like that into the puzzle? Or, and let me know if this gets too far for a fitness podcast, but
I've always been one of those people like, I'm never going to look back, right? It's always going to be like, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. And there's probably parts of my life that I'll miss out on, or there's things that I wish I would have done differently, but it doesn't do me any good. So like, I don't know. I wouldn't change anything I've done. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's something I'm trying to not fuck up.
Yeah. I think a lot of that stuff is like, when you look back, you're like, oh, I should have done this, or oh, I wish I had taken a different turn. Is usually, if you kind of think about it, it's what other people expected your life to be, right?
Yeah.
But when you realize it's like, I get to do whatever I want to do every single day, right? Like really nobody can tell me what I have to do. And when you kind of just like, you know what, every decision I make is my own and I'm responsible for it. You don't really look back and go, oh, I wish I would have done X, Y, and Z. Usually when I look back, I'm like, oh, I wish I would have done that. I'm like, no, because if I really wanted to do that, I would have.
Yeah.
That's something that other people probably think I should have done, but I didn't do because I didn't want to. So,
yeah, I feel a similar way. I try to, for the most part, so far I don't regret much. And I just don't want to get to the end of life and be like, oh, fuck, damn it, I fucked up. But, yeah. I think it'd be interesting to finish off with this. In terms of yourself as a researcher and then also sort of an entrepreneur, how do you generally find that you've made the decision to at times trend towards one or trend towards another, or spend more time on one versus the other? How do you generally find that decision is made?
It's kind of based on two things. One is value and the other is responsibility, right? Is at a given time in my life, where is my value best placed? Kind of what opportunities are in front of me, right? So if I think I can have a big impact on research, I'm going to put more energy in that. If I think I can have a big impact on a business, I'll put my energy on that. And the other is responsibilities, right? Like how many employees do I have, right? Like how much revenue is coming in? Is payroll covered? Is, all the stuff squared away that needs to be squared away for the business to grow? If it is, then, maybe a little more time gets devoted to research. If it's not, then more time gets devoted to the business piece. How much, what's the rest of my life look like? Like, how are my relationships? How are all that stuff? Is there going to be more? How much responsibility do I have towards that stuff? So it's always kind of a balance of where are my responsibilities and where is my biggest value and where can I put that?
And another question just popped into my mind. In terms of, do you feel as though, this is kind of a bit of a weird question, but do you feel as though in general we can, try to figure out how to phrase this correctly. For instance, in terms of like the family life and stuff, and we don't want to get into that. It's not going to go there, but because, but in general, do you find all areas, it's not, do you generally agree with the analogy that we sort of have? Say we have 100 watts of energy and we have different light bulbs to distribute it to. Do you find you do have to turn on and off different light bulbs? For instance, one might be family life, one might be social life, one might be entrepreneurship, research, or all that other stuff. Or do you generally, and maybe this is a bit out there for a fitness podcast, but do you generally think that analogy is true in terms of you have a certain amount of energy, you have to distribute it evenly, or you have to distribute it in certain areas at different times? Do you think that analogy generally runs true, or do you think in general it's not actually that limited? Or do you think, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you have a capacity, right, of energy you can distribute, and it's always in flux, right? Sometimes it goes more to your family, sometimes it goes more to your work, sometimes it goes more to, whatever. And I think people can also increase that capacity, right? Like I'm sure people who it's like their energy level of like their ability to do stuff is substantially lower than other people, right? Like how come some people, they work an 8 to 5 and it's like they just come home and they don't have any energy to like go to the gym or interact with their spouse. It's like that's all they can do. And then there's other people, they're up at 4, they're working 15-hour days, and then they come home and they spend 2 hours cooking dinner with their family and enjoying their kids at night, and then after that they spend like an hour reading and doing self-development, and then they go to bed, right? It's like it's very clear that everybody has a given amount of energy that they have to distribute, but there's also people have different amounts of energy. And so I think you can grow and expand that too.
Yeah. That's what I've generally, it's along the lines of what I think as well. It seems as though, like, I think willpower, I find that interesting, but I think it's something I'd like to learn more about, because I think it's maybe individual independent, as a lot of things are. But yeah. Anyway, so thank you for answering all those questions. That was a fascinating podcast for me, because I get to, just ask smart people questions, which is always fun on my end. So if people are looking to find you, do you do any coaching, or do you sell any products to people like who might listen to this or anything like that? Or how could they get involved with your work? Or is there any products you want to pimp? Or
so we do all of our coaching through Macros Inc. That's the company I'm the COO from. So if anybody's interested in nutrition coaching, go there. It's just their website's macrosinc.net. And you can find out pretty much every question you have about the company there. And so that's a great place to go get coaching. It's all one-on-one. We have a staff of really great coaches who've been really well trained. And so we all work together with that. I helped kind of write most of the nutrition certification for the National Academy of Sports Medicine. So that's a really great product. It was a lot of work with a lot of the industry's best people, and it turned out better than we could have imagined. So that's a really great resource as well. So it's just the National Academy of Sports Medicine's CNC, that's what they call it, the Certified Nutrition Coach. And yeah, that's about it.
Where can people find you on Instagram?
You can find me on Instagram. Just Google my name. I think I'm probably, put me in the search bar on Instagram, and I'm in there. And yeah, that's where people can find me.
Cool.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed. I know I certainly did. Obviously, it's one where I was just enthralled. Anytime anyone talks about these kind of topics with me, especially someone who knows these kind of things so well, just like Brad, really, really cool. Pretty fantastic for me. I hope you guys also enjoyed. So if you're looking to find Brad, he previously outlined where to find him, but there's links in the show notes to everywhere you can find him as well. If you're looking to find me, you can find me at the Hypertrophy Hub on Instagram. Name of the podcast, -podcast, there you got it. And then if you're looking to find me on Instagram, my personal account, that would be James_Walsham. So WALSHAM, M for mum. Cool. I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. If you are looking for coaching, I do online coaching as well. I've got a few more spots open before I start back up at uni, and I'm looking to fill those up before I start back at uni. So please send me a DM on Instagram or just apply at the link in the show notes. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast. It means the world to me that you guys enjoy and support this podcast. So yeah, thank you guys very much for listening, and I'll see you again soon.